Few questions are more important to our existence than UFOs. If aliens are truly piloting these crafts, then everything we think we know about the world gets turned upside down. Of course, maybe you think that's nonsense. And you wouldn't be alone. After decades of sci-fi films, many still dismiss it as a fantasy. Others swallow conspiracies whole. And maybe you're here because you're trying to figure out what to believe. The middle road, though, the one that rejects both gullibility and cynicism, is almost never walked. That's a road where we hold nuance, examine the evidence with academic rigor, and ask what it means for our lives. So here are the facts. A network of the world's brightest scientists has been studying this in silence. And in 2021, the Pentagon admitted what millions already suspected: UFOs are real. From 2023 to 2024, U.S. authorities received 757 UFO reports, and about 21 of those remain unexplained and are under further investigation. Taken together, the picture that emerges isn't just strange, it's destabilizing. But to do this subject justice without sliding into conspiracy, we knew we needed the right guide, someone who has lived on the middle road. That's why we turned to Diana Walsh Pasulka. Over the last decade, she has become something of a national treasure. A professor at the University of North Carolina, she was one of the first scholars to approach the UFO question not to prove or dismiss, but to understand. Her 2 books quickly became essential texts. She has infiltrated the secret society of scientists, and she has interviewed those who claim direct encounters. Diana has earned trust in spaces few are allowed to enter, and in doing so, she's become the leading voice for anyone brave enough to ask what these phenomena might mean. If you're new to Mighty Pursuit, we exist to help you make sense of the whole person, mind, body, and spirit, not as vague wellness cliches, but as deeply interconnected parts of your everyday experience. We believe putting the whole person back together is the key to living well. Today's episode zooms into our truth category, where we explore the biggest questions about the nature of reality, the possibilities of other dimensions, and what this all means for how we should live. This is one of the most comprehensive explorations of UFOs you'll ever see. We connect the dots with clarity, cut through the noise, and ask the questions others are afraid to touch. And by the end, you may find yourself making some shocking connections between UFOs and many of the other strange phenomena now entering the mainstream. So let's begin. Diana, in your second book, you describe someone you call the Gray Man. Mm-hmm. A pseudonym you gave to a career scientist who still isn't publicly on the record. But back in 1994, he reported seeing an object flying low over the trees in Australia. So can you explain to me what happened to him that night?
Sure. So this is the Brisbane Waters UFO flap that happened in Australia during that time. And it was witnessed by many people, probably like 100 people. And the witnesses they varied from ordinary people to police officers and, trained observers and people like that. So this man is a surfer and like a lot of people in Australia. And so he was on his way to his friend's house and he was driving along at night. And he said, as he was driving, he saw something that he thought was like a meteor. But he said that it didn't act like a meteor. So he saw this outside his car window, probably about, I think, 100 feet up in the sky. As it fell or as it, came along his car, he said that there was almost like an explosion and the whole area lit up like daylight. So this was in the evening at night and the whole area lit up. And so that scared him. And he's a person who is very conservative. He's told me he doesn't swear, but he used a lot of curse words, he said. And so he was frightened. And then he thought, a lot of people saw it, who they were also in their cars. And so a couple of them pulled over and he thought about getting out, but then he thought, no, I'm not going to do that because he realized that, he was a non-believer in UFOs. He didn't make a connection that it was a UFO at all or anything like that. He just knew that he didn't want to, whatever it was, military or whatnot, he didn't want to interface with it. So he decided to just wait it out, stayed in the car and then went forward. So that's what happened to him. It's a really interesting UFO flap. By the way, a flap is when a UFO over a few days occurs in one location and multiple people see it. So there's been many, many UFO flaps. So that was a well-known one. There's a lot of researchers in Australia, Keith Basterfield and Moira, I can't remember her last name, excuse me, Moira, but a great ufologist. These are people who study UFOs. They both have done work on that flap. I think almost every ufologist in Australia has probably looked at that. So that was a well-known flap, and that's what he identifies as his first experience.
The Gray Man, the pseudonym, is just so interesting because for everything surrounding who he was, and so he's a scientist who runs a major lab, right?
Yes.
Works at a major research agency, and yet he stays anonymous and was anonymous in your book. Mm-hmm. So he doesn't want to be known, and he's part of this group of people that you call the Invisible College, scientists, engineers that study this phenomenon in secret, people with high credentials, reputations. And so when I first learned about this group, it was very shocking to me because you hear about these sightings and you think it's kooky people that are seeing these things. And then as soon as I opened up your first book, it was like, wow, extremely smart people are researching this. And there's a secret society that's happening, which sounds conspiracy, but it's actually real. So can you explain to me what the Invisible College actually is and how you found your way into that?
Yeah, sure. So, okay. First off, you have to understand that I also thought this was kooky, and it was never my intention to study the topic of UFOs, which are now called UAP, unidentified anomalous phenomena. It happened because of studying I'm a religious studies professor. So what I do is I study the history of religion. And in the history of religion, people have extraordinary events happen to them. They see angels, or they pray for souls to go to purgatory, say they're Catholic and things like that. So my specialty has been looking at the ascent narratives, basically people believing that, they are, well, let's take a good example. So Dante's Divine Comedy is an ascent narrative. So he's talking about a journey that he's taking through heaven, hell, and purgatory. So within the culture of the West, we have these ascent narratives. So my specialty was looking at those and other world journeys. So after I was finished doing that, I studied a lot of aerial phenomena in the Catholic historical record. And in about 2011, 2012, I started to get correspondence from people in aerospace communities who did not know each other. But, I'd get it happened pretty often. And I started to wonder, why are they looking at my research? And they wanted to know, do I have what data I had and so forth. And so my perspective was completely historical and academic, in the sense that I wasn't approaching these as things that were real objectively. I was approaching them as cultural phenomena, may or may not be real. Okay. So we have to get that straight. That's my method. And it's not the method of the people who approached me who were in the aerospace communities. So they were looking at these as if they were real. And that shocked me. Because I thought, you're looking at, historical angel events or historical aerial phenomena as if it was, something real and not something like a weather phenomena or something. And they said, yes, we are. And so that's how I started to meet people who were part of groups, not just one group. So the Invisible College that is talked about in the field of ufology refers to a group of scientists who started in the 1950s and still work on the topic of UFOs. And they're physicists and information studies people, including Jacques Vallée is a well-known, in fact, I think it was Alan Hynek who coined the term the Invisible College. And he's repurposing that term from Francis Bacon, from the early modern time period when scientists had to be invisible because of what they were doing. Remember, there was a tension between the church and what scientists were doing. You know, they were looking at things like meteorites, and they were just looking at a lot of different things. Obviously, Galileo had a hard time, you know, and Copernicus had a hard time. So scientists who were at the cutting edge of doing aeronautic and, you know, looking at things in space and looking at bodies in space, cosmic bodies and so forth, they had to do this in secret. And so Alan Hynek, who worked for our government on UFO programs like Project Blue Book, he coined the term the Invisible College, and it included his friends like Jacques and himself, and people like Hal Puthoff, who's a physicist, and Eric Davis, who's a physicist. So those are all members of this American group called the Invisible College. However, they are not the only ones who do this study. So there are other groups of people, and I met those people first, who did this study and I wasn't aware of it. So I, independently of knowing about the Invisible College, I called them the Invisibles, because to me, these were people who had clearances. They couldn't talk about what they did, and they don't talk about it. And they live invisibly, in a sense. You know, they have their day jobs, which are affiliated with military or something, and then they have what they do, which is work on the topic of UFOs. And those people I called the Invisibles. And I met them about 2012. And I would say at that time, I met about 5 of them. And they didn't know each other, but they did similar types of things. So listen, the idea that we scoff at this, I scoffed at this. I do not hold this against anyone who looks at this and thinks that's not true, or, you know, that's silly. I thought that too. So this was my entryway into the Invisible College and, you know, the machinations of people who study UFOs.
Why are they currently still like invisible? Why would they currently not want to be known, or why would they be unable to be known today?
Yes. So the invisible college that most people talk about today with respect to, I'm going to use the term ufology, you know, this field where people study UFO events. The Invisible College they're well known now. So, you know, Hal Puthoff is well known. Jacques Vallée is well known within that field. They're not secret. So they've been doing what they've been doing since around the 1970s. Some of them have clearances and still do work on things that they can't talk about, and they don't talk about those things. There are still people who are involved in a program maybe, or programs. I actually don't know. I don't have a clearance. I'm an academic and I'm neutral on the topic. I'm not, you know, at the forefront I'm not promoting disclosure. I'm basically studying this topic. So I do know, though, that the people who are not talking about it and working on it, they're doing that for various reasons. One is national security. The other is that, you know, the programs have been secret for a long time, and maybe it's a process of bringing out that information.
One name that did come up about in terms of an institution that I saw through line in your books was the Stanford Research Institute. Mm-hmm. What role have they played in terms of the study and of these sorts of things?
A lot of people in the Invisible College are affiliated with the Stanford Research Institute. And the Stanford Research Institute is a really interesting thing that no one knows about, an institute that nobody knows about. What do they do there? They do remote viewing. They constructed ARPANET. I mean, you know, these are interesting questions. Why? What was happening? You know, what about the internet has to do with remote viewing? Like, how do these things, you know, how does that impact, you know, all of those, not all of them, but many of the scientists at the Stanford Research Institute are in the Invisible College, which studies UFOs. Why? So it points to something consciousness based. And so I don't know what the connections are. But I know that there are connections because the proximity of the programs.
So one of the scientists that you recently did an interview with is Dr. Gary Nolan.
Yes.
So if you do a quick search on his Google Scholar profile, I mean, this is like one of the most premier scientists in the world. He has like over 81,000 citations from fellow scientists, professor at Stanford University. So when you wrote your first book, he was previously anonymous, and you guys had visited an alleged crash site in New Mexico. When we discuss this topic of the invisibles, why do you feel like Gary Nolan decided to go public when so many others hadn't? Because that's like a reputation risk too, it seems like.
Oh, Gary's pretty untouchable.
Yeah.
So if you look at his, I visited many times his labs at Stanford. I took my daughter, she was interested in seeing what he did as what his actual job is, not his UFO job. And he's an incredible scientist and a nice guy too. And so the reason why he was anonymous in the beginning we went there in around 2016 or so. And we went to a site in New Mexico that was an alleged crash site. And I was going as a non-believer, wondering, I was going with two scientists who were believers. And I was wondering why they were believers. We had to be blindfolded to go. Okay, so the question at the time, he's James. So we called him James in my book. And he's very interested in the topic of UFOs. And a lot of the people who were in some of the other programs, not the Invisible College, but some of the other programs were interested in, like Tyler. Let's take Tyler, who's also anonymous, from my book, American Cosmic. So we have Tyler and we have James, and they're both looking at debris, UFO debris. And so Tyler wants James to analyze it. And so this is, before 2017. And in 2017, a lot of people know that a New York Times article came out by Helene Cooper, Ralph Blumenthal, and Leslie Kean. And it basically broke the news that the government was studying UFOs. After that, Gary felt a lot more, he felt freer about what he was doing. And in fact, it would probably help his case because a lot of people have debris, say they saw a UFO in their yard and debris is there and they keep it and they don't know what to do with it. And so now they know, go to Gary, he'll be able to analyze it and look at it. And so he saw this as a benefit, being known. So he disclosed who he was. And also during that time period, so I wrote my book before the New York Times article came out. It was in press while it was coming out. And then, so my book happened to correspond with a government disclosure of UFOs. And so Gary being in my book, he thought that it would be a really beneficial thing to do for the cause to come out as himself. So that's why, and a lot of people are now coming out. Eric Davis is talking a lot more freer about what he does. There's also the Soul Foundation, which Gary founded to look at this topic. And a lot of scientists, you also have Avi Loeb at Harvard University talking about it. So you have a lot of, Beatrice, from Sweden. She's an astronomer who's looking at, things in space. So these are reputable scientists looking at unidentified objects. So
you have these scientists and these engineers, but there's so much that has been made over the past couple decades of what does the government know? As you went through this research, what did you learn about how not just the United States government, but maybe governments around the world tend to view like the UFO phenomena?
Yeah, so a lot of governments are really open about it. So Brazil is open about it. France is much more open than the United States about it. Whether or not they have programs that study it that are invisible, quote unquote, I don't know. but I do know that the United States is very closed about this, or has been, and other people in other countries, a lot of people in other countries, if you take a country like Mexico or Brazil, you have a worldview that's different than here in the United States, where, it's a much, people will see something and they'll fit it into their maybe religious worldview or something like that. And so something that is unexplainable to them fits more within a worldview that they have. Some people in the United States have that worldview, but it's nothing that you see in the military, like that idea. If it's something they don't know what it is in the sky, they consider it a threat. So that's why we have this type of what you'd call like a I don't know how to describe it other than a very tightly controlled situation here in the United States. It's because the military sees something in the sky, they can't identify it, it's going to be a threat.
The most interesting thing you talked about in your book, for me, in terms of how the government views this, was Project Blue Book. And so can you explain what that program is? Because it kind of helps articulate this tight-knit nature in which the government has held this issue.
Yes. Okay. So the Project Blue Book was a program just after. So in 1947, you have the Roswell. You first have Kenneth Arnold, who's a pilot who has a sighting over Mount Rainier. And he calls these things flying plates, actually, but they get reinterpreted as flying saucers. And so this is a huge thing that happens in the summer of 1947. Very soon afterwards, you have the Roswell sighting. Anyway, so the government comes out, the Air Force comes out and says, we have a flying saucer in Roswell. And then it completely goes the opposite direction. It says, no, it was a weather balloon. Okay, that's suspicious, right? And everybody's like, what? So that begins this troubling kind of government conspiracy type. There's a conspiracy the government isn't telling us. Well, because they were not very transparent during the Roswell, whatever happened at Roswell. So you have this in the 1940s. So in the 1950s, you have a lot of sightings of things that people can't identify, and they call these UFOs because, the we already have media about UFOs, on TV and things like that. So people are saying, we see UFOs. So the government begins Project Blue Book. And Project Blue Book, the intention is it's run by Alan Hynek, and he is a professor. He's an astronomer. And so his task is to go out and look at these events when they happen and to identify what they are, and to explain them if possible, in order to make people feel better about what they're seeing in the sky. A lot of times he doesn't do a great job. Okay, so often he'll call something swamp gas when a lot of people know what it is. Okay, so in Michigan, a lot of people see something, they know it's not swamp gas. So they say, Dr. Hynek, please, even President Ford, he wasn't a president at the time, but he also was part of a UFO flap. And he knew that Hynek had called this UFO flap swamp gas. And he said, no, we deserve better than that. Can you please tell us what it is? Or if you don't know, just say you don't know. So this went on. And Alan Hynek, so this was from Project Blue Book, started in 1952 and goes until 1969. And Jacques Vallée is the secretary. He takes notes. So you've got already the Invisible College people associated with Project Blue Book. And Alan Hynek has a change. So he starts off by being a debunker, really, like taking an event and finding a cause for it and basically publicly talking about the cause. I mean, people are smarter than that, right? So they know that that's not swamp gas. And so then what happens is that he also he goes on so many of these field research trips. He meets so many people that are credible and don't want to see a UFO. Like, it's the last thing they want to see. They don't want their neighbors to think they're weird. So and he also has information, government information and things like that. So he does a turnaround, and he actually writes books later on in his life about UFOs and the topic of UFOs. So he becomes a believer too. So he starts off as a scoffer, doesn't ever want to see a UFO, and then, changes. So I think that is what happens. So if you don't want to believe in UFOs, do not start studying them.
One of the things that I thought was interesting is you wrote in one of your books that some of your conversations with government officials revealed that they believe that any sort of contact with like a non-human intelligence would cause social mayhem.
Yes.
And that being a reason why people are secretive about this. Like, how big of a factor do you feel like that really is as you've gone through this research?
Yeah, so there's a name for that now. And it's Carl Nell. He's a colonel, and he's been an advocate for disclosure. And he calls it catastrophic disclosure. He says this is how he frames it. If the government says, yes, UFOs exist, and doesn't say anything more, he thinks that will cause fear. And a lot of people will, it will have catastrophic social consequences. I think that a lot of people already believe in UFOs. So, and also if, we have a lot of people, more than 80% in the United States are religious. So their worldview is already incorporates this idea of something that's non-human and intelligent. And so I think it'll be all right. Like, I don't think that it's going to be catastrophic if the government says UFOs exist. And in fact, the government has been saying that in the past, since 2021. They say that they exist. They don't know exactly what they are. They haven't said that they're extraterrestrial or anything like that. But you have, when you look at what happens in the government, it's confusing. You have military, people who are associated with the military coming forward and saying, these don't look like they're from Earth, right? And then you have people from other parts of the military basically saying, we can't say that because we might be able to identify them given time. Like, we just don't know what they are. So the government doesn't even have its own record straight. They're not even coherent among themselves. So of course it's going to be very confusing to the normal person who wants a straight answer. Is it extraterrestrial or is it not extraterrestrial? You're not going to get that information from the government.
So for people who are not familiar, the 2021 event was a big event. So what was the Pentagon stance on this prior to 2021? And then what did they come out and do in 2021?
Right. So in 2021, the Pentagon, the Office of National Security released a document that basically said that we are going to study this. We're going to study those cases which are truly, we don't know what they are. And we're going to do this through these various programs. So it was like a game plan, and it was big. So they released it, and they established some groups to study it. So here we are in 2025, and a lot of people say, well, the groups you've established aren't really doing too much. And, there's a lot of frustration, I guess. But it was big. I think that, it's a big news when the Pentagon comes out and says, we acknowledge that there are things that we don't know about. We don't know what they are. So I've talked to people in various of those offices, and, a lot of them say, look, in time we'll be able to identify them, and most likely they won't be extraterrestrial. All right. That's what they're, kind of the official idea is. But on the other hand, then I talk to other people who are affiliated with the programs, and they're like, they may not be extraterrestrial, but they're definitely not ours. They're not from Earth. So that leaves, this big category of, okay, maybe they don't know what they are, and they're truly unknown. What kinds of progress have they made? I don't know. Okay, I do know that they're still interested in the work of people like me who do historical scholarship in, this type of thing. And
Yeah.
so it's ongoing.
Why now? Well, because this had been going on. I mean, I guess obviously the government had been aware of these things before 2021.
That's right.
And so what was it about 2021 that made them finally be like, okay, yes, all this stuff is real?
Okay, so I get asked this question a lot, and I don't know for certain, but it appears to me that us and Russia, right? We've had the viable space programs where we go up into space and we see what's up there and we launch things into space and so forth. Well, that's not the case anymore. Now, lots of different countries are launching into space and seeing things, especially China. They're seeing things in space. They're launching things to the moon. And so we don't have, we had kind of a reciprocity with Russia, in terms of it was us and Russia. We were like, we may have fought on the ground, but we were bonded in space. And so I think that other people get to see what's in space. And so we better come clean and say, okay, yeah, there might be things in space we don't know about. So maybe that.
Yeah, I mean the aviation and the space thing that had to rank at maybe top 3 for me of like most surprising things that I read. Which, the idea of reading that like astronauts are essentially signing in NDAs of unable to fully discuss what they've experienced in space. I don't know how much you can say about this, but why do you feel like there's that culture of silence with aviation?
Okay, so this is really interesting. So there's a huge culture of silence within not just for astronauts, but for pilots as well. And, people like Ryan Graves, who is a pilot, and my friend E.O. Whiteley, they've helped try to cure that situation within aviation, right? So when pilots see things, they want flight time. Like that's their job. But if they see things that are unidentified, people question their sanity. And that's bad for flight time because they could be demoted. They could, their flight time could be 0, right? And they're discouraged from talking about it. All right. So apparently, and I didn't know this either, actually. So when I was first doing the study with Tyler, who is a mission controller, so he knows a lot of astronauts, and he was with his friend who's an astronaut, and they were having this conversation, and they said something about NDAs, and I thought, NDA, celebrities have people sign NDAs,
yeah. And
I said, what's that about? And Tyler said, well, astronauts see things in space. And, so now I understand. Like, of course I was shocked because most people don't know that, but it makes perfect sense because, again, it's a lot of national security type of thing that's happening. So they're going to have to sign NDAs. It's part of being, in a program that you have to have a clearance for. It's a special people get to do it. You have to train your whole life really to do this. So it makes sense to me now. But at the time, I thought it was very strange.
Yeah. I mean, so when you take the body of all of that stuff, and when I was going through your research, I mean, the scientists, the engineers, the government, the aviation, the astronauts, all of this stuff is like, and even your personal story coming into the subject, I'm like, okay, there's so many people that are in very smart fields that are not government and all these places that are taking this very seriously. And it seems like people should take this like very seriously. And I think that as we get into like the phenomena itself and like what people actually like report seeing, it's interesting because it's like very, in some ways, different from sci-fi movies and other things that are being said. So, with all that in mind, I just want to go straight into like the facts basically of what people believe that they're seeing or report that they're seeing, because the implications of that would be huge. And so after reading your book, it seemed like there were basically 3 pieces of this phenomena that may or may not be connected. So let's just start with the first one since we've already alluded to that, which is the aerial phenomena piece of this. And so what actually sets UFOs apart, or UAPs, what they're calling it now, from any other aircraft in terms of how they move and how they seem to defy the laws of physics? Because I think that would really help people understand why the government or the Pentagon would be saying, well, there's 20 of these in 2024 that we can't really figure out what's,
Yeah, that's a great question. So generally, when we look up and we see satellites or we see airplanes, we see a linear trajectory, right? We see the direction in which it goes, and it's straight. It goes one way. It's not making erratic moves. It's not turning on a dime. It's not moving up and down. It's not moving toward us. Okay, so these are the kinds of movements that pilots are witnessing and people that see UFOs. They witness UFOs dancing around, sometimes often, sometimes splitting apart and going back together. So these are obviously non-ordinary. And we don't have planes, even drones make movements that are not like planes, but not like that. They go at speeds that are really in excess of, what we think we have, in terms of our technology now. So those kinds of things.
Is it true? Is this a myth or is this true where people say that they just drop into the ocean or something like that?
Okay, yeah. So that's true. When people have these observations, they've seen what are called USOs, right? Unidentified submersive objects. My own father actually saw one of these, and I can talk about that because part of my initiation or so forth into this study was to then look back on my own life and see, times when people would tell me things and I thought, that doesn't make a lot of sense, but I know that they're good people and they wouldn't make that up. So it made sense more of that. So Admiral Tim Gallaudet has spent a lot of time with people who have seen these objects, and he's done a lot of historical research also about it. And so basically, those types of objects look like discs, right? They'll emerge out of the ocean. You'll see them on radar, like submariners have seen them on radar. Then they emerge out of the ocean and fly up into the sky, which obviously is pretty non-ordinary. I like to tell my own father's story. So my father has passed away, but in the 1950s, he was a sonar person or radar person for the Coast Guard. And so he was on this ship called the Bittersweet. And they were in the ocean around near Russia or Alaska or somewhere around there looking for Russian submarines, basically. So they were out doing that. And this is, a long time ago. So I'm hearing about this as a kid in the 1970s. And my father was an attorney, not a believer in UFOs. But he was also a person who wouldn't discount people's observations. And so he saw something on radar coming at their ship, and it came toward them, and it was giant. He said it was huge, maybe like a football field. And so it kind of frightened them, although he didn't say that he was frightened. He's a macho guy. So he didn't say he was frightened, but he said that they were pretty concerned. Maybe it was a submarine or some type of weapon that they didn't know about, right? So they were, this is a pretty serious situation. Well, once it got under them, the ship completely lost all electric. They couldn't do anything with their electricity. And so they were stationary. They couldn't move for 4 hours. And then it went away. And it just went away. Yeah, it just went away. It just moved on. And then they were okay after that. And so he talked about that. And it was one of those things that as a kid you remember because it was so strange. So as a kid, I remembered that. And then even after American Cosmic, I didn't think about it, even after I wrote American Cosmic. But what happened was Tim Gallaudet started to talk about the USOs. And I thought, whoa, I think my dad actually had that experience. And when I listened to the data from the people that he interviewed, I recognized it as being very similar, as being like a pattern match. So I asked my brothers about it, do you guys remember when Dad talked about this thing that he saw. And they had better memories than me, you know? And so we all pieced it together and actually told Tim about it. And, so that does happen.
That's so fascinating. I mean, the fact that it's happening in the sea, I can't even imagine how startling that would be for your father for that to be happening.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I alluded to this, but just to make it clear for people. So since 2021, the Pentagon has released a report every year, right?
That's right.
So I think if I'm getting this correctly, in terms of the numbers, last year, at least from the middle of 2023 to the middle of 2024, they had received 767 reports of aerial phenomena. And they identified 21 out of that as things they could not immediately identify as, I guess, ours or whatever way you want to put this. So if you look at that report specifically, I think that says a lot of things because, first of all, a lot of people are right when they say, okay, a lot of these things are not actually UFOs or UAPs and all of that stuff. And that it's something else that's happening there. So there's validity to that. But when there's also validity to the fact that a smaller subset of this, they couldn't identify these things. So when they say they can't identify, does that mean that they fit into these sort of patterns, the USOs, the going to the sea, the physics? Is that really what they're referencing when they say they can't figure it out right now?
They say that they're anomalous. So anomalous would include all those things that we talked about, like submersives. And
what does anomalous mean?
Okay, anomalous is it doesn't fit into any known pattern. So it's outside of the patterns that we associate with aerial phenomena.
Okay. So is there significance behind the fact that they changed the name from UFOs to UAPs?
Yes.
Why?
Okay, so, well, first off, UFOs have so much baggage, right?
Uh-huh.
So what's a stereotypical UFO? It looks like a disc craft and, little gray beans come out of it kind of thing, right? Okay. So they want to disassociate UAP from that idea because really, and this was shocking to me too, and part of the reason I scoffed was I was like, oh, right, people think that they see just exactly what that night watchman said he saw, right? But they apparently seem to see things like that. And I wish they didn't, right? Because it would make my job a lot less weird if I could say, yes, they see these, craft and this is what they look like. But another thing that the reason why they called it, they first called it unidentified aerial phenomena. And then they recognized that that's not right either because it's not necessarily aerial, right? It's in the ocean and that type of thing. So they wanted to account for different media within which these objects appear. And so they appear in the water. They appear in the air. They have, things that we can't explain. And so anomalous gets at that. So it's unidentified anomalous phenomena in order to account for transmedia type of objects, like coming from the ocean into the air.
Now, you said this earlier, but I think it's relevant to bring up now. So from your research, how far back do kind of credible sightings go? Is it the 1890s, like you said, or like it's way before then that people started seeing things?
Okay, this is such an interesting question. So in my research in Catholic history, what is interesting is that when people had experiences of aerial phenomena in, say, 1200, which they did, and they recorded it, they also would establish the person's credibility, which is really interesting. It's what we do today too. So they would basically say, and so if you see, so I was at the Vatican doing research on Joseph of Cupertino, who is a saint known to levitate, right? And so his records, they were written like in the 16 and 17, around the 1700s. And they're written in like languages that are really hard to decipher. But one thing is for certain is that when I was going through his documents, and they were huge, like several of them, more than 5 of them that are like that big, right? And so a good portion of one of the documents was basically just listing the credibility of the people who witnessed his levitation, right?
That's crazy.
And so who are they? Well, they had this position. They were mayors of the town, or they were bishops, or, so they established what they did. They were trained observers. They were, their reputations were impeccable, right? And
basically, they're not crazy.
yes. So this idea of the credibility of the observer goes back 1,000 years at least. Okay, so today, how do they establish that, right? How do you establish credibility? Well, it's almost like the same thing. Does this person have a position? What position in society do they have? Would it hurt them if they went public? Right? But they're doing it anyway, or they're, talking about it anyway. Are they trained observers, people who have access, like pilots? Are they people who get fired if they lied? Police officers and so forth. So this is how different organizations establish credibility in different ways.
Logically, that makes sense to me because, and that's one of the reasons why we were so excited to have you come on, is because with this phenomena and other phenomena, it's like you have these two kind of binary camps typically, which is like a hyper-skepticism. I'm going to say no to every single thing that you say to me because I'm totally closed off. This can't happen. And you have this overindulgence of every single thing is true. And there are green men in my backyard and I'm interacting with them all day long. So, which I'm not saying that that's not happening, but there's kind of like a rush to affirm everything that possibly could be happening is happening. And so I think that it makes sense in the human mind that we would try to work through this to figure out what's real.
It looks like it, yeah, since we've done it historically.
Yeah.
I think that it's a natural inclination and is good. We need to do that.
Now, the biggest ones that have really gotten attention are Roswell, Phoenix Lights, and Zimbabwe. And so why did those three in particular, amongst others, get so much attention? Okay,
so the Roswell, this happened in 1947 in the summer, and it was just coming off of Kenneth Arnold seeing what he called flying saucers, right? So, and also you have the Air Force saying that we have a recovered UFO. And then I think it was hours later, if not, maybe it was the next day or maybe hours later. I don't remember that correctly. But it was soon after they say we have a recovered flying saucer. They made a press announcement that they go back on that and say, no, it's a recovered weather balloon. And look, here it is. So obviously that's going to get the attention of everyone because that's something that, that would be the big smoking gun kind of thing.
Yeah.
All right. So that's why that. So, okay. So then we have the Phoenix Lights. We have school sightings in Zimbabwe. We have one in England. We also have one in Australia. And those kids that when this happened in Zimbabwe, you have John Mack going to, Zimbabwe and ufologists in Zimbabwe actually, looking at that event. So you have multiple witnesses. You have all of these children who see something and they describe it almost exactly. They all have grown up and it's the same thing with the Australian sighting. They've grown up and they maintain what happened. So they're not going back on what they've said. Those kinds of things. You also have teachers who were involved in each of those sightings. Some who saw, like in the Australian sighting, they saw the craft and, the grown-up children just have been recently brought back together and talked about it in Zimbabwe and maintain their story.
So the significance with a lot of these are that there's like large groups of people that simultaneously saw it at the same time.
Yeah. So, if you have one person seeing something and no one else can see it, that's not an event. But if you have corroboration among witnesses, especially if they don't know each other. So the school sightings, they know each other. But if, say, the Brisbane Waters, sighting in Australia in the 90s, you have people from all over the place who don't know each other making the same claim. And the Brockport UFO flap, too.
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting because that brings up an entirely separate subject. But one of the arguments in Christian thought around the resurrection, there's the account in the Bible where it says that like 500 people saw Jesus rise from the dead. When it comes to these sightings, similar to that, is it your understanding that it's impossible for there to be like a mass delusion at the same time? Like, is that why, I mean, we're talking about credibility. Is that why this would lend more credibility? Because like the idea of people seeing things at the same time, mass delusionism is impossible.
A lot of people use that term, mass delusion or mass hysteria, being hysterical, mass hysteria. Okay, so a lot of people use this term, mass hysteria or mass delusion. And I honestly don't know what that is. So people talk about that and I say, what is that? Can you explain where that term comes from and give me an example of one? Okay. And I never get a good answer. So I would say that that's somewhat of a cop-out. Now, could they be seeing something that's not real? Of course.
All simultaneously?
I don't know.
Yeah.
But what I'm saying is that if you have corroborating witnesses that don't know each other, they're not obviously having a mass, hysterical event. Also, you have to understand that a lot of times there is corroborating data like radar reports that identify something. So what is happening? I don't know. But is something happening? It looks like it.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because if you think about the court of law, right? And if someone committed a crime, now you're trying to figure out whether to like convict that person of that crime. And if you bring 2 or 3 witnesses into witnessing something like that would be, and it sounds like their accounts line up, it's like that would potentially be enough evidence to like lock somebody away. So then when you have these kind of mass sightings of something and it's like 100 people or something like that, that's like a lot of people to see something at the same time, which I just find to be really, really interesting.
I was going to just ask you if you were suggesting, I'm not making a claim one way or the other, but to compare it to like Jesus's resurrection, so assuming that didn't happen, I guess your assumption is that didn't happen. Jesus didn't resurrect. And a lot of people just were upset that he was crucified, who were friends of his and thought they saw him. Right.
No, I actually think it's convincing, like what is said about that as well. I mean, you do have, it's written in one place that happened. But if you assume that account is correct, that 500 people saw that, I think it's interesting because how would 500 people see something at the same time and report the same thing? So in that instance as well, I find that to be something that you would lend credibility to versus just one person witnessing something. Usually that gets explained away as mental illness or schizophrenia or like some other thing that's happening. I think we're kind of getting in a category of how do you weigh evidence? How do you logically, intellectually process through weird or hard things? And in my mind, like we live in this society where so much is put on the scientific method, which I think is amazing.
Yeah.
I think there's so much amazing things that have happened in society and that we've discovered because of the scientific method. So that's one way of working through and finding something that's true. But I don't think that's the only way to find out what's true. And I think people people probably at their core don't believe that's the only way to find things that are true. But when it comes to weird things, they want to default and be like, no, well, that's the only way really that we can know things are true is if we use the scientific method. But then when you start going through these logical exercises of credibility and witnesses, the burden of the evidence, it feels extremely illogical that when I look at 100 people seeing a UFO thing, that something's not happening there. I might not know what that thing is, but like something must be happening. And so that's kind of my take on it.
Yeah. And the scientific method doesn't disclude observational data. That really is where it starts, is with an observation. And when observations are corroborated by, say, a radar report or something, then that is stronger evidence that something happened. By the way, with respect to the resurrection of Jesus, there's a professor, I believe he's at Princeton or Yale, and his name is, and again, I hope I get this right, Dale Allison.
Oh, yeah.
He's
Princeton, I think.
That's right, yeah. And he's written about that. And his argument isn't that that it was true, resurrection, or that people are having a mass hysterical event, but he's got a great argument for people did see this.
So when you read reports, like the last piece I want to get in about the aerial phenomena aspect of this is, so when you read reports of objects shadowing military jets, flying over nuclear sites, or kind of outmaneuvering like our best technology, from what you've discovered, are those modern media fiction inventions, or are those things that seem to be a genuine facet of this kind of UFO phenomenon?
Right. So again, you have a lot of people who are military, would prefer not to have seen what they saw, but saw that happen and reported
the shadowing?
it. Yeah, the shadowing, and also just UFOs around, nuclear facilities. And that's been going on since we've begun that research. It's not fiction. Those things that, what I'm saying is that, I'm not saying those are UFOs. What I'm saying is unidentified things are associated with those facilities and people seeing them.
Okay. So the second piece of this phenomenon, right? So you have the aerial phenomena that, let's just say, we're making a distinction that is sort of happening at a distance. And then, the second piece is the artifacts, and then we'll get into like the encounters and more like close-up stuff. So the logic follows, right? If there are aerial phenomena, right, some of those have crashed or something, right? And like there must be evidence of like aliens or people that are like little aliens on the ground, and we have the aliens and they're kind of locked up somewhere, and then we have all these crashed materials. I found it was so interesting because in your first book, obviously you opened up with a visit you personally had to an alleged crash site in New Mexico. We spoke about this with Dr. Gary Nolan, and you mentioned the other person has a pseudonym of Tyler. And so can you explain like what happened there and what you guys found?
Yeah, sure. So this was early on, in my study, and I wasn't a scoffer, but I was a disbeliever, absolutely. And I wanted to know why, I'm looking at the belief in modern aerial phenomena, why people believe they're UFOs and so forth. And so here you have two subjects that were excellent. They were well-known scientists, very credible. And so Tyler had asked me if he knew I didn't believe. And so he had said to me, you should come, to a place, and I think it might change how you think about this. Right now, you just think that it's, in the imagination and that it's not actually physical. And I couldn't argue with him. I was like, that's right. And so he asked me to go to this place in New Mexico, a crash site, he said, and it wasn't Roswell. He said it was another one, because he said there were several happened during the 1940s, which of course I thought, it just doesn't make sense to me, but okay, I'll go, right? But I didn't want to go by myself because I thought that was kind of scary, frankly, and plus I had to be blindfolded to go to the place. And so I asked a friend of mine who's a colleague in religious studies, and he said, it's out of my comfort zone. I don't think I want to do that. And I thought, okay, I'll ask Gary, because I had just met Gary and I had seen a couple of his presentations to small groups about his hobby, which is studying UFOs. Immediately, he was like, let's go, let's go. So he was very excited to go. So I had to convince my friend, though. I said, look, this guy, he's a Stanford professor. I think you'll want him to go, because if we find anything, which I was dubious we would, but if we find anything, at least he would be able to analyze it. He's got all the cool equipment and so forth. So apparently he did his due diligence and he came back and he said, sounds good, let's go. So we all went, okay? And we were blindfolded, and Tyler drove. He'd been at this site many, many times before. So this is part of what he called his hobby job, which was looking at these parts and finding people to do analysis, like material studies analysis of them and things like that. So, it was in New Mexico, pretty high up, I guess. And we had to wear boots because there were rattlesnakes there. And we had all this equipment that he had configured, metal detector equipment and things like that. So I was just going as an observer, doing this book, which they knew about because I was very transparent with them. And I said, I am writing this book about this belief, this emerging belief. It looks like a religion to me. And you guys look like the priests. And I'm doing this and I hope that's okay. And they were like, let's do it. All right. So we were all on the same page. Me, the disbeliever, them wanting to get their hands on this stuff. So we go out there and we do find stuff, but it's not like out there everywhere. And another thing is that there was a lot of rubble out there. So it took us about 3 hours to get there from the place where we already were, which was fairly, I thought, remote. So we get there and this place is filled. Once we get the blindfolds off, I look around and the place is filled with this rubble. And Tyler noticed that I was looking and he's like, these are old cans that have disintegrated from the 1950s when the military came out here. And they put all these, they wanted they didn't want people to have their metal detectors and find this stuff. So, I took that down in I didn't believe that was what it was or the reason or anything, but that's what he said. Mm-hmm. So it's part of data for his worldview. So that's how I understood it. And later, by the way, when I wrote about that part of it, my editor asked me to take it out. And she said, it just doesn't make any sense, Diana. Why would in the middle of nowhere in New Mexico be all this rubble on the ground? And I said, you're right. It doesn't make sense. I don't know why, but we have to leave it in because it was there. Like I saw it, therefore it's the data. So I had to convince her. And, she was from Oxford University Press. Mm-hmm. So this is a press that only does peer-reviewed scholarship. So I have an obligation as a professor to collect all the data and then try to make sense of it. So I didn't have any way to make sense of that other than to suggest that this was part of his worldview for explaining that this was a real crash site. So that's how that's really how I thought about it at the time. But regardless of my interpretation, this is data. Mm-hmm. So she was okay with that once I explained that to her. She was like, all right. It was the book got really uncomfortable for her at times too. And in fact, she was the one that wanted me to write it. But at times she was like, you can't say this. This is just too far into the belief category. And I was like, I'm not saying it. These people are saying it. I'm reporting what they're saying. And she's like, okay, as long as we're okay, as long as we know that. So anyway, so we went out there and it took us a while, but we did find stuff. We did find, debris. And, they did what good scientists do. They had their gloves on and they put it in, these little bags that they had mm-hmm. and they dated it and, all that kind of stuff. So we continued to do that throughout the day. And then we came out with a good portion of this stuff that was really hard to get. It wasn't just lying on the surface. Like we had to first find it with the metal detectors and then dig for it. And so we did get a lot of stuff. And afterwards, when we got back in the car and we headed back to our place where we were staying, there was a fire, and we were around the fire. And Tyler told us what was going to happen when we went back through the airport. And he said, we're going to get stopped. First, he's not going to get stopped because he just gets to go through the airport, because whatever clearances he has, he doesn't have to go through TSA. So Gary and I are going to have to go. And so I say, you take this. You're the one who's going to, look at it. And he, of course, he wanted it. So he's like, okay. But in fact, the things that Tyler predicted happened when we went through. He did get stopped.
Gary did.
Yeah, he got stopped. I didn't get stopped because I didn't have anything on me. And Tyler was waiting on the other side, just waiting for us, drinking a water. And I was really nervous, and so was Gary. We were both really nervous. But it turned, Tyler said it was going to be all right. He said, they don't know what it is. There's going to be a signal that goes to someplace in DC or whatnot, but it's not going to, the folks down here, they don't see it as any problem. And that's what happened.
You had an interview with him, I believe, about a month ago.
That's right.
Yeah. So what's your perspective on like where that case stands now in terms of the materials that were actually taken from the crash site or alleged crash site?
My position is exactly the same as it was when I wrote the book. So that's not, my field is not to identify what this is. This is something that feeds into a growing belief in UFOs. So that might be a disappointing answer, but my position is the same as it was before. I ultimately don't know what this material is. It could be completely prosaic, benign material, right? That's Gary's looking at that. And so he gets to report. I reported what he said. He said that he didn't think he thought it was something that was engineered, but he didn't know why or how. It would have taken a lot of money to do that. And during that time period, he didn't think that people could do it. Tyler believed it was from some type of craft. So that was, those are things that they believe. Now remember, they're both scientists. So the more data they have, their belief will change, because when a belief becomes something that doesn't change, it's a dogma. And they're not dogmatists. They're scientists. So the more data Gary will get, the more. Now, if he gets data that says, don't study that stuff anymore, from an unknown source or something, that scares him, he might stop, because once one gets into the field of doing this research, there's things that you shouldn't do because
Does that actually happen?
Yeah, those things happen. If you talk to David Grusch, they happen.
So, I mean, in terms of the artifacts, when I started researching this is where it gets like very complicated, because I was looking through these reports of how they actually measure this, and unless you understand
isotopes and things like that,
it's really hard to like. It's almost like impossible for the average person to understand this language if they went to school for this, because a lot of people make these blanket statements about the crash sites and the artifacts and all the stuff, and like, well, they have aliens, and this is how we know. But it's like, then you get into the data, and it's like, I don't even understand what how do you actually differentiate between what is a alien thing and a human thing? So when people are making these claims, I don't know, this might even be hard for you to put into words, like, what are scientists looking for that would be this comes from humans, versus this is a non-human thing when they're looking at some sort of artifact or whatnot?
Yeah. So this was my question in the last chapter of the book, or even in the conclusion of American Cosmic. So Gary and Tyler are talking about the site and how important it is to have access to this information and the debris and data and so forth. And I'm still thinking, what if it's just Russian or Chinese or, something like that? So I ask them, I say, are you sure this is, and they both looked at me like, are you the idiot in the room? No, so the thing is that you're right. They both spent a lot of time learning science. I spent a lot of time learning about history and religious studies. So when people talk to me sometimes about religion, I can't, and they're way off. sometimes I don't even engage with them because I'm like, well, they're obviously, I can't bring them up to speed, right? And so I think that's what they were thinking about me. We're not going to be able to bring Diana up to speed. Can't she just accept that we know? And so thankfully, I don't have to say yes or no. I don't have to say, yes, this is aliens, or, this is an alien debris, or no, it's not. That's not my question. That's not what I do. So I don't know. I know a lot of scientists who study it and say that it doesn't look like it could have been engineered then or whatnot. But I can't. I mean, he is a tenured professor, and so these other people have the U.S. government pays them to do certain kinds of jobs.
Yeah.
And so I think that our government would know if they were fakers, right? If they were just saying this because, it's a bunch of kids, 12-year-old kids, and I've got alien debris. I found it in my backyard. That's not what's going on.
So, for a skeptic listening to this conversation, the most far out claim potentially that they might hear is that, the government is withholding confirmed alleged artifacts or even like biological evidence of aliens or alien bodies. So as you investigate this like whole phenomenon, like what do you make of those claims?
Yes, I'm with them. I'm with the skeptics. I think I have not seen any evidence of that. I know people who have said that we have evidence of that. But I am a skeptic. I'm a skeptic with respect to that too. We should be skeptical.
There's something to be said about the physical evidence of aliens. This is where if you really want to take an intellectual pursuit through the UFO phenomenon, you have to start making all these distinctions, because there's this kind of lumper category, this lumper of everything's the same, and it's almost like you come into it with this narrative that you already have or you want to believe about what exactly is happening, and then you start making links between all these things, and this is one thing, and it's this very specific type of alien is invading our world on these aircrafts, and then they crash, and then we retrieve the thing.
Right.
So one big thing that happened in the news that can be discussed publicly, because it went on record about this, if people are unfamiliar with David Grusch's testimony, can you explain who he is, what he alleged, and why that was controversial?
Sure. Yeah. So this was at a congressional hearing in 2023, and he was a whistleblower. So he got whistleblower protections. Now, who is David Grusch? So he is a decorated combat veteran, and he has worked for the Air Force and Air Force intelligence for 14 years. So he has an impeccable record. He is an impeccable person, has impeccable credentials. And so he worked for what's called the NRO, which is the National Reconnaissance Office, as an intelligence officer, and the NGO, which is the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency. Your listeners most likely do not know what these are. So what these agencies do is they are our eyes in the sky. Okay. So they're United States, the NRO takes care of the satellites that go up, reconnaissance satellites and things like that. It was secret for a long time. And if you've ever seen have you ever seen those patches, those mission patches, and they're totally weird looking, but they're cool also. So the NRO all has these patches that they release when they put a satellite up, and they're mission patches. And then the NGO so the NRO gets the data and the NGO interprets it. Okay, so these are the people. We're in space a lot. Okay, so there's a space race happening. And so these two agencies are super important there for us, for the United States. So David Grusch is an intelligence officer with respect to these two agencies, and he works between them. So he has access to what is being seen when we send satellites up, and he has access to what is being interpreted about what we see up there, like the NDAs that we talked about earlier that the astronauts have.
Yep.
Okay. All right. So he this is what he alleges. All right. So he says that, and by the way, I'm actually really happy that Dave Grusch talked to Congress and got whistleblower status and so forth. Because to tell you the truth, when I did the first book, American Cosmic, I was just a professor doing this work, didn't know about these communities, did not, I was really shocked to find out that aerospace people took it seriously. More than that, I was shocked to find out that people that I was interviewing were part of this program, a program, okay, which I didn't have any words for. So I called it the Invisibles. So David Grusch in 2023, my book's released in 2019. In 2023, he comes along and he starts talking about this legacy program, a program. And I was like, I think that might be the program that I, stumbled upon when I was doing this research. So it made a lot more sense to me, my own research, by his allegations and what he talked about. So he basically said this, that there is a program or programs, but he talks about this one program that's where people study UAP. And he said that we have recovered craft and what he called biologics, which could range from a lot of different things. And I could talk about that too. But just Dave Grusch. So this is what he says. He says that they haven't been informing Congress, that they're in a sense autonomous from Congress. And therefore there's a lot of it's illegal, right? And that's basically what he alleged. And so he had to get protections in order to say those things. And that's why he was called a whistleblower. And since then, other whistleblowers have come out and talked about the program and what they've seen and things like that. So those are his allegations.
Now, you use the word biologics.
Biologics.
What does that mean?
So when I heard about biologics from Tyler a long time ago, before this hearing, before my book was published, what he was referencing was we have access to space where it's zero gravity, and we can do experiments there that we can't actually do here on Earth with materials and so forth. And this whole field is called biologics. So it's different forms of biological things that we could create off planet. And it seemed pretty legitimate to me. It had nothing to do with aliens or alien bodies. But this was how I was introduced to this idea of biologics. And so when Dave came along and said, we have biologics, that's exactly what I thought he meant was, well, yeah, we do, because we're actually creating things up in space. It's like a laboratory for us. And, but I think he was talking about actual bodies. I don't know. I haven't actually talked to him about that. But it sounds pretty much that's what he's saying. So, I can't say anything about that. I have not seen any. When I learned about biologics, it wasn't about alien bodies.
Now, what is I don't know if you talked to the Invisibles, the rest of the Invisibles about David Grusch's claims, if you could share anything about that.
Okay.
Or what they think of it.
Well, so this is a good question. So I did have access to people who were part of that, if it's a program. I do not now. So after my book was published, there was no more contact with certain of the people in the program. And I'm happy about that. And they are too. And it was because of what they do. Mm-hmm. People in the Invisible College, like Hal Puthoff and Eric Davis, they stand by Dave Grusch. Tim Gallaudet stands by Dave Grusch, and what he said. So I don't have any access to like Tyler D or I don't know what he thinks.
Yeah, I mean, from my perspective, when we take these components of the actual what we call the UFO phenomena, I thought it was important to first talk about the aerial phenomena and then the artifacts because of how they kind of bleed into the third part of this, which is when people claim to encounter these objects or a non-human intelligence up close. And this is what really blew my mind because it's not at all what I thought people were actually saying. So when people report close encounters whether with a craft or any sort of beings, what actually happens in those experiences, and kind of what are the common threads that you found across the testimonies?
That's a good question. So, and again, it was really shocking to me too. But let's take like a flap. Like I go back to the Brockport because that's a great flap to go back to. The first witness is, the night watchman who sees the weirdest things, right? The craft parked in the parking lot of, I think it was a library. And he saw little beings. And no one else saw those. So it was reported by like at least 30 other people. And no one saw that.
The little beings.
Yeah,
okay.
And the craft. They saw something in the sky that was, they reported as being shining and beautiful with multicolored lights and things like that. And a little thing on the back, very much like you see in a Close Encounters movie. It has that little tail in the back. They reported that. Okay, so the thing is that often, and this happens in religious, when people have visions, apparitions, and things like that in religion, people see different things. So he saw this, but no one else saw that. Often when people have these reports, they do see different things. And that's, like I said, I don't want it to be that way because, you and I, when we look at something, we see, like the Rubik's Cube, we see a Rubik's Cube. We know what it looks like. We can describe it to each other. But they see different things. And I'd like it to conform to our reality, but it doesn't. It's non-ordinary, but it is data. So they see different things. And that's one thing. Another thing is that people report subjective experiences with the thing in the sky. They feel that it either sees them or they have a kind of like a communication with it, which they don't like. Okay. They don't necessarily want to have communication with this. It somehow inhabits their mind. And that's data too, and that's very simple. By the way, that's when I realized why the people from aerospace communities were reaching out to me, because people who see apparitions or angels or, things like that, they report similar things, that this is communicated with them. And they don't really, they can't stop it, right? It inhabits their mind. They have no sense of cognitive sovereignty, right?
Yeah.
So that is another thing that's similar.
It's interesting. In 2020, Miley Cyrus said, I was driving through San Bernardino with my friend and I got chased down by some sort of UFO. The best way to describe it is a flying snowplow. It had this big plow on the front of it and was glowing yellow. I did see it flying, and my friend saw it too. There were a couple other cars on the road, and they also stopped to look. I was shaken for 5 days. I did see a being sitting in the front of the flying object. It looked at me, and we made eye contact, and I think that's what really shook me. Looking into the eyes of something that I couldn't quite wrap my head around. When you hear an account like that, does that sound... Like, what do you make of that?
Yeah, that sounds like a typical account, that there are multiple witnesses. It's unexpected, in many ways unwanted. And it doesn't look like, she describes it like it doesn't look like the typical kind of, flying saucer craft. It looks different than that. And sometimes it does look like that too. That's the thing, and, it sounds like that sounds like a typical, and that she was shaken for 5 days. It sounds like she's probably still, I'm sure that made an impact.
Yeah. I mean, because most of us grew up with these like kind of pop culture images of UFOs and aliens. And obviously Steven Spielberg, 1982, E.T., extraterrestrial. I mean, you get this picture of these like little gray men, which I don't know. I don't know if that's what she was saying she was seeing. She was saying she was seeing something, some sort of being. But when you think about that specifically, this idea of like little gray men, like wraparound eyes, how do the real accounts differ from the stereotypes? And do the stereotypes arise from real accounts, or are those just media inventions?
No, I think that the stereotypes arise from real accounts that people have of little gray beings that they experience, in their rooms or, near a craft or something like that. So people do have those experiences. And again, this is something that it would be great if they didn't, because, then our reality would be a lot easier to deal with, but especially my job. So, I've been a professor for many, many years. And when I first started talking about this, I was concerned because I have to talk about things that are pretty weird, but that people experience. Whereas in history, you can easily say, oh yeah, they experienced this and they called it a demon, or yes, they called it an angel, or this or that, right? And nobody's going to think that your research is weird. But when you start talking about modern accounts and that people are still having these experiences and they're calling them different things, because you can see those little gray beings or those little shiny beings back in the historical record, people having experiences with them. And it's much more acceptable to talk about it that way. But now, if I say yes, so a lot of people see this now, that's going to be a lot weirder for people to accept. And it was for me,
Yeah. No, I mean, this is where people get really uncomfortable with the subject. I mean, they probably get most uncomfortable and most think it's like a sign of mental illness when you start talking about alien abductions. And, John Mack was the head of psychiatry at Harvard Medical School. And so he became one of the first academics to seriously study alleged alien abductions. So for people unfamiliar, what did his research uncover about this?
Okay. So, John Mack was an extraordinary researcher at Harvard. And he had already won the Pulitzer Prize for one of his books about, I can't remember the book, but he had won the Pulitzer Prize. So he was, in many ways, someone who was like Gary, untouchable, right? So he had already proven himself as a researcher. He was, tenured, kind of above reproach. And he actually didn't believe in UFOs and didn't believe in UFO abductions or anything like that. So he came from the position of a disbeliever. And he started to talk to people who had these experiences through Bud Hopkins. So Bud Hopkins was a painter and a well-known artist in New York City who began to study people who were having these experiences and helping them deal with it. So he told John Mack, and John Mack started to admit into his practice people who had these experiences. And through listening to them and going over, basically studying a large group of them, he came to recognize that they were normal people. They didn't have, any pathology whatsoever. No
mental illness.
No, nothing. They were completely normal. And he did, because that's the first thing he was wondering is this a new form of almost like like I called it like the emerging religion. He thought of it as the emerging mental health issue.
Like schizophrenia.
Something
almost.
like that. Yeah. He thought it was going to be a problem for Americans. And so that's why he did an analysis, and he found that they were completely normal people other than the fact that they said this happened to them. And often they didn't want to be known, like they didn't want to come out and tell their work and stuff like that or their neighbors, but they would tell him. So that's how he became a believer. And after he started to study this as if it were real, right? So he said, I don't know what it is, but I absolutely believe people are having real experiences and that was brave. And then he was, Harvard actually, investigated his work. So people didn't like that a person from Harvard was talking about UFOs. And so, and it went on without him knowing that this was actually happening. And then he found out and it was upsetting, of course. He hired an attorney, a famous attorney, Dershowitz. And he actually said, why is it okay, Harvard, to study angels, but not to study modern day reports of UFOs? And I thought that was a great point, because Harvard has Harvard Divinity School. And a lot of people are studying historical angel reports, but you can't do it today. You can't study, people's reports of aerial phenomena and ascent narratives. People levitated back 1,000 years ago and associated that with some of these accounts. They're doing it today. They're levitating. They say, okay, I levitated into this, airship or whatnot. Whereas back in 1,000 years ago, they said, I levitated into this flying house, right? So there's like a pattern match. And that's what Dershowitz was basically getting at, was that why is John being vilified for something that, that is being done at Harvard Divinity School?
Now, one of the most common rebukes to all of this stuff is, if this is really happening, why don't we have thousands of clear photos and videos? I mean, especially today, iPhone, stuff like that. We mentioned the Jesus thing earlier, but, people joke about that. Like, oh, well, if the resurrection happened today, you could have just taken an iPhone and started filming it or something. And so why isn't that true of these encounters?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I don't know why. I think when people report it, so people report having terrible dreams or nightmares, and we don't question them. Prove it. We know that because we have them. We have terrible dreams and nightmares. So could these people be in an altered state of consciousness experiencing this? Well, that would explain why we don't have, So rather than subject them to ridicule, especially if they're generally credible people, we just don't have the answer yet. So, we can't take a photo of your dream, right? But you're still going to have that dream.
Yeah, I mean, this kind of gets to the kind of crux of the entire conversation about where things just totally broke open for me. And I was like, this is nuts, which is that how often these encounters start to blur into things that we typically would associate with something that's like paranormal or supernatural. And so what are the kind of effects that people report afterward, and how do these experiences then change them?
Well, I don't know if you've had anybody on your show who has studied near-death experiences.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
So
one person. Yeah.
Okay. So what I found, and I'm in religious studies, so a good portion of what I've studied are these things that we call ascent narratives, but they're also near-death experiences. And so what happens after near-death experiences is similar to what happens after somebody has these experiences. They have a life transformation, but they also have this. They also, after near-death experiences, a lot of times people they feel like they know things before they happen, like precognition or something like that. They report these effects. Whether or not we can prove them is another question. But this is what they report. They report that the things that they thought were important before are not important now. Like maybe they were, focused on buying a lot of really nice cars or something. Mm-hmm. Nothing wrong with that, by the way. But their focus changes to being some people I've known who have near-death experiences become, help starving people, right? And that's what they just focus on that. People who are hungry, they feed them and, wherever the need is. So they have a life change. So you do see this. You also have people report, the non-ordinary knowing of things. Again, we can't, I can't prove any of that, but that's what they report happens to them. So these are some of the things that happen after they have these events.
That really dives into what kind of many leading researchers you write about. They don't actually see this potentially as a physical extraterrestrial phenomenon. They see it as something kind of stranger, which would, I guess, bleed into what you would typically call a more spiritual lens with this phenomena. And so can you explain why so many people frame it that way and kind of what that tells us about the nature of the phenomenon?
So there are degrees, which is why Alan Hynek came up with the, Close Encounter of the Third Kind, of the first kind, of the second kind, of third kind, and then other people kind of changed that just recently. So, because there are so many degrees of these sightings, and they're all not the same. Like you just talked about Miley Cyrus's sighting, right? Well, it looks pretty much like a physical sighting of a craft. Maybe there was a radar that picked that up. Multiple people saw it from different cars, and she saw a being of some sort. Okay, that's going to be different than the UFO kind of abduction narrative where a person's in bed and all of a sudden they're surrounded by these gray beings and they can't move and they want to get out and they're terrified. And then somehow they're taken into a place where there's a light like this, by the way. And, they're subject to being examined by these beings and so forth. And, this is a terrible thing. And they want to get out and, they're horrified and they don't like this. So that's very different, right? So that's is that a dream experience? It happens in bed a lot. I don't know. I've not had that happen, but I've met people who have, and I believe them, and they don't want that to happen to them,
So some of the most credible voices on record, like we mentioned, Jacques Vallée, is one of them, suggested that whatever these beings that people see are interdimensional. What does he mean by that?
Yeah, I think that's kind of a catch-all for we don't know. It doesn't look physical, but it happens. Okay, so I'm going to give you an example of an anomalous phenomena that happens to Teresa of Avila in the 1500s. She's a doctor of the church. She was a nun. Mm-hmm. And I'm not going to say this was a UFO experience, but it was an anomalous experience that has pattern matches to modern day reports. Okay. So what does happen to her? So she is in a convent and she prays a lot. And at one point, and she, by the way, she wrote this down because she could write. So she wrote it down in her diary. And so what happens is that a being shows up that's about 3 feet tall to her left. And she doesn't know what it is. And she says, a being showed up and it wasn't an angel that I was aware of, but it had to have been because, right? What could it be? So she said it was an angel. And then she kind of goes through what kind of an angel could this be? It was shiny and it was something that she was not used to seeing, and it was real. So mostly she said if she imagined angels, they were always in her imagination. Mm-hmm. But this one was actually real. And then what happened was it had like a dart, an instrument, and it had a dart with a flame on the end of it. And it was put into her bowels, is what she says. And this caused her to pain and ecstasy at the same time. Kind of like, she didn't like it.
In her
but she
stomach?
didn't hate it. Yeah, in her bowel region. Yeah, her entrails is how it's. All right, so that looks pretty similar, right? If you're reading John Mack's Abductions, you see a similar type of instrument. You see, this, what is this thing that's taking me, it's 3 feet, it's kind of shiny. So there are similar, and by the way, after that, she also had a lot of what were called charisms or gifts, right? Of knowing things. And so her life changed.
Yeah. I mean, when you look into the details about these things, to your point, it's like they start echoing things that people have said for really long times. Mm-hmm. And that's where my mind really became warped because I'm like, what's the difference between an angel or a demon or an alien? I mean, I don't know what your take is on that, but what there seems to be a lot of continuity in terms of, I mean, these are all just words.
They are words. I do sense differences in people's experiences. So when you look at Teresa of Avila's, I'm not going to say it was a a modern day UFO report. I'm going to say that this is her experience. Let her talk about it. And then the Catholic Church they actually rewrote it a couple times, but thankfully we have her own words about it. And she's interpreting this through it's an angel, right? So people having experiences today, could I be saying they're having the exact experience? I'm not going to say that they're having the exact experience, but there's definitely a match in various patterns of that experience. Could we be using our own reference, cultural frame of reference, was we call these experiences today, modern day UFOs, is a technological angel, right? Something like that. I'm hesitant to do that too. So I know it's frustrating not to have a straight answer, but
that's a weird. I mean, it's a strange thing. I mean, it's hard to have a straight answer. I think the word that you're using about pattern matching is appropriate, because I think the best that we can really do is, at least at this point in time, I think, is to like make these pattern matches and try to figure out how these things are different or similar. And the main through line that I got from this third piece of the phenomenon about these encounters is that it seems like they're good and bad at the same time.
Yes.
So it seems it plays into those archetypes, right, of angels and demons, for the very fact that there's positive and negative experiences with these things. That's
right. So some people do not want this to happen to them, and they see this purely in negative terms. So if they lived during the 1200s or 1400s, they would call this demonic. Theological communities today, there are lots of theological communities that basically say, well, these look like demons. If you look like E.T., if you see E.T. in Spielberg's movie, he looks like a little demon. Okay. So yeah, he's friendly and nice and, cute and everything, but, they call that a demon. So there are different theological communities that look at this from the perspective of, there's a pattern match, all right, and call a spade a spade. That's how they view it. Okay. So, if it's an incredible experience they have, they'll say that's an angel. Part of the reason I kept doing this, because in the beginning, I found it very odd, the community. There were lots of people with clearances and, 3-letter agency type people. And I really wasn't into that. So I was going to leave it and go back to just doing Catholic studies. But what drew me back in was, Brenda Densler, she's a PhD from Duke who studies this and wrote a book about it too. And she had this huge archive, and she actually donated it to me. I didn't want it at first. I was like, I'm getting out of this. And this was a long time ago, 10 years ago or so. I said, I'm not going to do this anymore. But I started to look through the archive, and there were so many reports from people who would just write her letters about their experiences. And they said, to me, this was the best thing that ever happened to me. It was like an angel encounter. I feel like this is an angel. Or, the opposite. And that's when I started to see this as, okay, I can actually look at this and use the methods of religious studies to look at it. So, yeah.
One of the most striking things that you wrote in one of your books is that there are some in government programs who believe UFOs are demons, and that they're actively engaged in thwarting UFO research because of this belief. Obviously, that's like a huge claim. So when you first heard that, like what did you make of that?
Yeah. Well, people in programs in military and so forth, they're just like everyone else. They have a belief system, and there were people who, and I believe they are still there, by the way. And this is a bad thing, and we shouldn't be dealing with this. And so, yeah, that's part of the belief system. There are people in the Invisible College who are wary and do not believe in aliens per se, but do devotionals in terms of they're very devout religiously. Mm-hmm. And, so I mean, that's when you get into belief systems, people are going to come at this from different perspectives.
Yeah. I mean, I think when you talk about belief, you talk about theory, all this stuff, I think it's interesting if you observe the people that actually went through these things, because it's like, it doesn't just stay at the level of like at some level, you and I are like theorizing right now and like just discussing the data.
Yeah.
But it's very different for like someone to actually go through the experience and for it to be like an embodied experience. And now I'm just carrying this for the rest of my life. And then you have these like after effects that happens. And I kind of wanted to pull that apart because, you know, you mentioned this thing a couple times, which is that witnesses and researchers often report the strange feeling that once you become aware that there's a phenomena, it becomes aware of you. So if you could put that into words, like what are they saying there?
Yeah, actually, so an author that really gets to this point, and there was a movie made about one of his books called The Mothman Prophecies, and this is John Keel. And he's fascinating, by the way. Be careful if you read his work, because he's definitely, he's not a historian. His scholarship is, you know, he's not a scholar, but he actually does field research, and his work I find to be compelling for the fact that he's looking at the effects that this has on people, and he thinks it's terrible. So basically, he says, don't study this if you can help it. In the Mothman Prophecies, there's a cameo of him. It's not actually him, but it's a character based on him. Mm-hmm. And so the Richard Gere character, if anybody's interested, watch this movie. It's the Mothman Prophecies. It's an old movie, but it really does actually get at this idea that once you start studying it takes notice of you, right? I think even he said that. And by the way, Friedrich Nietzsche, who's a philosopher, has nothing to do with UFOs, but he also has something very similar where he says, you know, once you stare into the abyss will stare back, right? So it's one of his famous quotes. And it's this idea that once one becomes aware of, I would call it like non-ordinary reality, which Nietzsche did become aware of, but he was very careful not to become a believer, like a spirit, you know, that it was somehow spiritual, mm-hmm. you know, and things like that. So he practiced like a hygiene with respect to it, which is what I think John Keel does too. So he has this idea that because he studied this, he said that a friend of his started to study angels, and then he was bedeviled by angels, like, you know, for 10 years of his life, you know, all these like angel events would happen to him and stuff just because he was studying this topic. So John Keel studies UFOs, Men in Black, Bigfoot, you know, all of these very weird things. And once he started to do this, his life became filled with weird coincidences, and strange happenings, Men in Black type of things and everything like that. And he writes about it with humor, very dark humor, but humor nonetheless. And so this is an element that's actually, I would say, it's an experience that people have that, you know, once they truly get into this type of thing, a lot of things happen like that to them. The Men in Black thing happened to Gary, you know? So, yeah.
I mean, how does that awareness like connect to the paranormal or spiritual after effects that people experience? Are those two connected in any way? Like the awareness piece and the after effects?
Yeah. So it seems to be the same, I guess. Once one becomes hyper aware of it, then let me give you an example. Mm-hmm. Okay, so Kenneth Arnold, you know, he's one of the first big, you know, UFO, it's a big sighting, right? So he actually wrote a book about it. And for him, it changed his life in a very spiritual way. But it also brought a lot of these very strange synchronicities, coincidences, things that he couldn't really understand. These things started to happen to him. And he writes about it in his book. So there's an updated version of the book, by the way, by I think it's his granddaughter. And so he talks about this too. You know, he's just a pilot, a normal guy. And then he has this sighting. And then after the sighting, he has these effects. One of them is that he had done an interview with some people in this house about his sighting. And a couple days later, he went back to the house to get something that he thought he'd left there. And the house looked as if nobody had been in it for years. There were overgrown plants. He couldn't get in the door because it was, things like that happened to him that he couldn't explain. Things happened with his airplane because he was a pilot. And they were unexplainable, very strange and odd things that go right along with John Keel and his, what he writes about.
The dreams aspect of this I thought was very interesting because that's also another thing that has typically been associated with a more spiritual realm or aspect. So what exactly happens with people in their dreams after these sort of encounters they report?
So very interesting. Len Philpott.
Yeah.
Yeah. He was the young person who experienced the Brockport UFO in 1967 and then had a series of very interesting events throughout his life. And so he has dreams that are where he has knowledge that non-ordinary knowledge that he couldn't have gotten. And one of them involved a person who was in need, like psychologically in pain. And he had a dream about that person that he needed to tell that person something, in order to help him. And it was a person who had passed on that told him this in the dream, came to him and said, look, you need to tell so-and-so, let's just call him Fred. You need to tell Fred that this is the reason this happened, and it'll help him because he's in a lot of spiritual pain right now. And so Len woke up from the dream, and then he told his wife, and he said, do you think I should do that? And his wife said, yes, I think you should do that. So he went the next day in the morning, found the guy, told him, the guy completely understood what he was talking about and said, oh, thank you. And so it did help him. So Len wouldn't have dreams like that. So he's an extraordinary person. And his life after the UFO event, basically his whole life, he's had these kinds of extraordinary, absolutely mystical, looks like kind of very wonderful events.
Kind of connects to like another idea that I think is really interesting about like downloads or quote unquote downloads, which I actually like resonated with like that type of experience. How like I knew exactly when you use that word, I've used that word before, which is kind of the sudden information that feels given and not generated. And so how do you understand those, or how would you explain that aspect of
this was one of the most interesting things that I learned. And when I studied American Cosmic, I saw both Gary and Tyler, scientists, engage in a similar process. And so Tyler's process, he learned from the training that astronauts go through. And so he would apply that to his life because, when you're in space, you want to have the optimal physical body because you're in space and there's a lot of stress there. So they learn everything they can about how to make efficient the human body for astronauts. So Tyler would take what he learned and apply it to his life. So he didn't drink coffee. He barely drank alcohol, and he slept as much as he slept for 8 hours, and then he would force himself to have 1 extra hour of sleep. So 9 hours in total. And then he would go outside and get some sun, and he would hydrate. And he said that would put him into a frame of mind where he would be extra creative and he would be able to get what he called a download. And so I asked him, what's that? And so by the time I knew him, he has something like 44 patents. And these were being used, aerospace patents and things like that and biomedical patents. And so he said, this is what I learned. This is like a protocol that I use in order to have this information come into my experience. And then what I do is I take it and I make technologies from it, and very successfully. So he's a multimillionaire, making lots of money from doing this. And so then when I had talked to Gary, just kind of, I asked him about how do you get ideas and so forth. He had a very similar idea or a very similar type of protocol. So he had his own protocol, which is similar. So I started to look into the history of this with science, and people like, there's a mathematician named Srinivasan Ramanujan, okay? And he is an early 20th century, he's passed away, mathematician who was untrained, trained himself in math, and it was a genius at math. Still, there's a whole journal devoted to his math, and people can't figure out how did he do that. And how he describes his process is that the goddess Lakshmi, his local goddess of, I can't remember the name of the specific goddess, but a manifestation of Lakshmi would whisper this in his ear. And of course, the people at Cambridge who were, his colleagues wished that he would never talk about that. But when people said, how do you get your ideas? He would tell them that, this goddess whispers them I don't actually come up with those ideas. So once I started to look into the history of science, I recognized that science is really unorthodox. A lot of people are getting these genius ideas. Genius literally means, by the way, this type of experience where something whispers into your consciousness. Yeah, like an inspiration or something like that. So and also people who do research and creativity, they've studied this too. So apparently what happens is and a lot of people don't think it's their idea because their frontal cortex shuts down. It doesn't shut down all the way, but it dampens down. And so people associate it with something incoming, like something inspiration or something like that. Yeah. So you can actually figure out how to do inspiration, which is really interesting to me. So I found that out through doing this research.
When we talk about pattern match, I really love that word because one of the guests we've had on this podcast is Dr. Lisa Miller, and she's a scientist at Columbia, and she studies the science of spirituality. And if you read her book, The Awakened Brain, now they put people through MRI machines, and they were able to locate basically like the neural correlates of kind of the spiritual experience in the brain. And so much of what she wrote was in parallel to what you were writing, which is just so interesting because it's just like completely different fields where she's talking about synchronicities. She was talking about this idea of downloads. She was talking about these kind of states of awareness that people have. And that's where things just like really, I got thrown through a loop because of like how common these things are. And when you talk about these states of awareness and these experiences, like most people throughout history have associated them with like God.
Yes.
Essentially.
Yes. Yeah.
And so they've associated getting this type of download or information or dreams or even this fact that you feel like something other than you is causing you to act on something, kind of like you were mentioning with the guy with Dream earlier, Len. So I'm curious what you think of those parallels with God.
Yeah, I think it's great. I think that right now we're at a point in history where my field research can be corroborated through scientific analysis. And I've seen this happen, but I think that we could make a mistake. And this is the mistake I don't want us to make because I don't think we have enough data to make this mistake. That's what's called reductionism. Mm-hmm. That's we can reduce those experiences that people have that they attribute to God or a transcendent reality, a reality objective from us, to just brain states. And I don't think we have enough information to do that. While brain states can, be, let's put it this way. I spoke about this earlier to you. We have senses. We have eyes that perceive data, right? And we can make sense of it because we have a brain. We have ears that allow us to hear things. Well, we also have a spiritual sense, even though we don't know where it is or whatnot. It sounds like she's making headway in identifying where it's at. But that doesn't mean that there's nothing, that doesn't mean it's just subjective to the person. There's information that is picking up. Well, what is that information? Could that be what people called God, or they still call it God, by the way. So, what I'm saying is that we shouldn't then, I've seen a lot of scientists make this and philosophers make this reductionistic argument. Well, it's just a brain state. Therefore, there's no objective morality. There's no objective transcendence. I don't think we can do that. Frankly, I think that there might be, and we have to keep that door open and we just can't close it. We just have to make our way through the data.
Yeah. One of the things that we've been trying to do on this podcast, so we had Lisa Miller on, we had Dr. Jen Holden, who has studied near-death experiences for like 40 years, and she is like the editor of the scholarly peer-reviewed journal, the Journal of Near-Death Research. And then we also had a hospice nurse on who was like talking about what happens to people right before they die. And I mean, I'm comfortable saying, like, in terms of where I've arrived, in terms of what I think is true or based on evidence or proof, I think through near-death experiences, like there's one variable with near-death experiences that I feel like blows everything out of the water, which is what people describe as a veridical experience.
Yes.
Right. So this, to me, like, if you really think deeply about this, feels like an objective proof that there is another dimension that is not located in our physical body, which would expend to the reality that consciousness is not solely located in the brain, but is funneled through the brain. And what I mean by that is, like, let's just say I have a heart attack right now and I fall on the floor. And I'm on the floor, unresponsive, potentially even if I were to be studied in that moment, like my brain shut off and like my heart's not beating anymore. Now, down the hallway, the people on the computer, like 3 rooms down, are having a conversation. And somehow I report floating outside my body, like moving through those doors without even opening them. And then I'm hovering over those people in the other room and I'm listening to everything that they're saying. Now, let's say someone has resuscitation technology and then is able to bring me back from the dead, essentially, and now I'm alive. Now, oddly, like a conversation might come up that I overheard exactly what those people were saying down the hall, and to verbatim the point that when they even become aware that I knew what they were saying, they become extremely freaked out. And when you look at the accounts of near-death experiences, this is all over the place. The fact that people like leave their body and then end up being able to see things down the hall. And so if you really think about that, you're like, well, that quite literally is not a physical thing. I mean, I don't know what way you'd be able to intellectually reason with that, but like if I'm down the hall and I'm not in my body and I know exactly what's happening down the hall, it's like something's happening there. And, you know, when we had Julie McFadden on, who's a hospice nurse, she was talking about those things. And I think it's just a pattern matching thing. I don't think after reading your research, I can definitively say like what exactly is happening with this UFO phenomenon, but it does seem like a lot of things are interesting about this idea of another dimension, consciousness. Consciousness seems to be this thing that's being circled with like all of these fields. I don't know if you have a opinion on this cross corroboration of that.
I agree. And the veridical near-death experiences, that's like the UFO, right, of the reports, like the 70, right? So with near-death experiences, you have a bunch that could be explained, but then you have those veridical ones. There's a great book called Fingerprints of God. I don't know if you've read it, but it's basically there are several accounts of veridical NDEs in that book, written by a journalist, and I can't remember her name. But it is, your viewers should read it. It's a great book. And, you know, it has people who are blind who are then have an NDE and then can see things that they're very confused at first because they're like, what is this? You know, and then they're like, I think I'm seeing things. And, you know, and people who, when they die, all their senses are, for whatever reason, because of the surgery, you know, they have blindfolds on and their ears are patched up and stuff, but they still can tell what happened in the surgery room and, you know, what kinds of techniques were used and so forth and equipment. Yeah. So that's the point I was trying to make, is that, you know, there's something that we don't understand going on. And we, you know, I don't know why people are so quick to do reductionist ideas. Like this just, you know, this is a brain state. This happens to you before you die and so forth. When we have so much observation that suggests that's not the case.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, you know,
another thing that came up with the hospice care nurse is like, what's really interesting also is terminal lucidity, especially in Alzheimer's patients, where like physically, if you look at someone's brain that has Alzheimer's, like it's literally disintegrating, like it's crumpling up, it's smaller. And then they get to a point, and my grandma had Alzheimer's, where they're like literally not even functional. They're just lying there. And there are instances of people right before death where they'll experience terminal city, or alternatively it's called a rally, where they'll come back into full consciousness and they'll start talking to you like nothing ever changed and like all their memories have returned. And so you start looking at all these things and it's like, okay, well, a valid theory could potentially be that consciousness is in some part located in the brain. That's obvious. I think with mental illness and other things that you could see these kind of waves that are happening, but maybe it's like being contained in the brain, that there's some sort of larger overall awareness that's happening. And through stuff like this with UFOs, like we're like tapping into some sort of larger overall awareness, and that when we die, that I've heard it be equated to the fact that we're in like a warehouse and we have a flashlight, and all we can see with our mind right now in this physical world is like what's in front of us. But when we die, like all the lights in the warehouse like start to get turned on, and we're fully aware of something that we could only see in part or in sprinkles or in downloads or other things. And so I don't know, I find you can't have certainty about some of these theories, but you pattern match, and then you see the thing with the NDEs, and I'm like, oh, this is all interesting.
It is really interesting. One of the first NDEs recorded is in Plato's Republic, which is, 2,400 years ago. Plato writes the Republic about Socrates. These are Greek philosophers. And so the Republic is a book about justice. And so Socrates is trying to explain that we should be just, right? We should be good to each other. And the people he's speaking to don't agree. They're like, why? Because we won't make it in society if we're just, right? That's ridiculous. Like why, we're in it for ourselves, and that's just the way the world works. And so Socrates then says, well, okay, let's examine justice. So the whole thing is talking about in the end, though, he can't actually give them a really good reason. But what he does is he basically talks about two things. One is the allegory of the cave. And the next thing is this NDE. And he says, there's a soldier, his name is Er, and he died. He died on the battlefield. And he went and he was able to see, what happens after we die. And whatever you do in life, you're either rewarded or you're punished. So this is a pre-Christian, kind of Greek philosophy. It's not even Greek religion. It's Greek philosophy. And so he basically says, and this is, there is something that's objectively real beyond us, and justice has something to do with it. So it was his way of answering their arguments, to try to say there's something beyond that. Now, what's really interesting is that his group, Socrates' group, including Plato, who wrote the book, they believed that one could access certain kinds of knowledge that was transcendent to humans. And a lot of that were mathematical ideas. And so basically he trained a lot of his students in math. They had to do that before they were philosophers. Mm-hmm. So they were training parts of their brains in order to like ascertain something that was interdimensional, right? And he did do that because he identified what we now call the Platonic solids, which are these like fourth dimensional objects, which we can't see because we're in 3 dimensions, but which people who do computer programming can model. So then they're called now, after Plato, the Platonic solids. So he was literally onto something that, so I always tell my students that when I tell them about justice, and I say, this probably works. This is probably real,
What do you, there's all these terms that I feel like are interesting, right? Like, because when people see UFO phenomena on the news or watch some documentary or whatever, the way we commonly think about it is there is another alien race on another planet that is invading our world. But when you start thinking about it in these terms, like what is the difference between a post-death reality or an interdimensional reality or like a black hole, or I don't know, there's all these terms that get thrown around, and it's like because of our own pre-existing worldview and bias, like we want to use one term for it. Maybe there are differences between some of these terms, but I'm not sure how you think about it after going through all these research in terms of dimensions, how we would think about dimensions.
Yeah. So, should there be found extraterrestrial life or something like that? I mean, that's going to be definitely within our wheelhouse of reality, right? So it would be, say on this planet or so forth, and, they'd have some kind of vehicles that, could come here or there, or basically we'd interact with their technology. We send our technology to Mars, right? And so they might send their technology here. Okay, so that would be within three-dimensional normal reality. We could probably get our heads around that. So I think it's this other aspect that's so difficult to talk about because we don't really have any language to talk about it with, these other dimensions and, what are people experiencing when they've passed away and they come back and they say, no, this happened to me and I have this information that's veridical, right? That's, you can verify. I think we're just at the very beginning of understanding that. I think religious traditions actually have information about that, but we tend to discount those. So, during the 1700s and so forth, we have the Enlightenment, right? Where we kind of like discard a lot of wisdom from previous, religious traditions for whatever reason, right? We have our reasons for doing that. And so a lot of those traditions probably have interesting information for us. So in the 1980s, a scientist, a physicist I believe it was at UC Berkeley, wrote The Tao of Physics. And he basically said, look, these guys were onto it way back in the day, right?
Taoism?
Yeah, Taoism, and it perfectly describes this quantum world, which we're learning about now. So there's a lot of history that we could actually go back into and say, this makes sense. Kind of like what the aerospace people are doing with me, what you're saying about Joseph Cupertino, that actually makes sense to this. Let's get more information.
Yeah,
about that.
I mean that's really interesting because if you do look at these things like religious traditions, like there is some sort of information that, like data, like you said, or like what is being communicated here. I mean, there's instances where like even if I guess you take the Bible or something like that, like there are a segment of scholars who would say there isn't one thing on the other side of a physical reality, right? Like there's God, but like there are other beings that are on the other side, like, and that might not be equal, like with God, but like there are other things on their side. So when you look at these, I mean, Hinduism is another example where like there's room for multiple things that
multiple worlds
are on the other side. And so I think it kind of opens up the possibilities of what exactly is being, interacted with. I mean, Gary Nolan went on the Jordan Peterson podcast I think this was a few months ago. And he explicitly said the line that something non-human is here, and it has been here for a long time. When you hear that, what do you feel like he means? Yeah,
so he and I, of course, have talked about the history of, the framework of demons, angels, and these things that populate the other world. And he did say, when we were out in the desert, actually, he said, Diana, if this was 100 years ago, we'd be talking about demons and angels, So I think that's what he's talking about. He's referencing that there could be presences that we are now detecting and have been here, and people back in the day detected them too, by other means, perhaps.
Which with that line is just so striking because if you look at how Gary moves, and I've, in preparation for this interview, I just like studied kind of his posture and his mentality. He's so cautious. He's so cautious to say anything, even the way that he looks at data and not making like premature judgments on things, and then also correcting himself like if he got something wrong. And I think that goes back to like the credibility thing, when you see someone who has reached the highest levels of academia and is like one of the most preeminent scientists in his field in the world, like come out and say something, it puts more credence to the subject because there's been so much study and analysis that has went into making a statement. It's not like I'm just saying things because I just want to say it. You know?
Definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't think anybody in academia, I'm speaking from experience, would actually do this if we didn't have a lot of information and data that backed us up. Like, why would I do that? I was already at the chair of my department, a full professor, it didn't make sense for me to come out and do this kind of study publicly, unless I believed that there was something to be studied.
Yeah. Yeah. I think the way that I wanted to kind of close is to like, how do we implicate the listener in some sort of way? And like, what I mean by that is like from the stories that you've collected, like what's the most striking way you've seen someone's life change after an encounter? Like how they see their purpose, their relationships, or potentially even death differently?
Okay. So, I won't name names, right? But I have seen a person who is, a professional and experienced what they didn't know what it was actually. And then through talking to people like me, Gary, Jacques, people like that, Leslie Kane, understood that what they experienced was what we study, and then thought back into their life and recognized that this had been something that they have experienced their whole life. And in fact, even their grandparents had these experiences. And this shifted their life so much that they became convinced that they actually went back to their religion. So they had been born and raised in a specific religion. Mm-hmm. And then they, like a lot of people kind of like, that's how I was raised, but I don't believe that, but I'm a good person, and went along with their life. And then once something tangible happened to them, something that they could say, this is real, it confirmed their religion for them. They were like, oh, this is actually what they were talking about. Now I see, I better change my life. So they literally changed their life. They became a better person. They got there's a saying in Christianity, get your life in order. Mm-hmm. They got their life in order.
What, you have been doing this for like 13 years after studying this. How has this whole process impacted you and shaped you over the past 13 years?
Yeah, so it's been a rocky kind of road because of everything that's happened. It's been really exhilarating too, though, because I did this not knowing that the government was going to, come out and disclose and, have these congressional hearings and so forth. Not at all. So I was very surprised. I was doing something that is done in my field, which is looking at emerging beliefs, new religious movements and so forth. So it wasn't out of the ordinary for someone to do this in my field. But there's no way I could have predicted all the things that happened. And also meeting aerospace community people who believe in it and study it, mm-hmm. and then being exposed to all the different theories. I would say that it was, that it hasn't changed my life. Yeah, of course, absolutely has changed my life. And it has reconfirmed a lot of what I studied. I'm a geeky kid, right? Yeah. I was a geeky kid. So I read a lot of philosophy as a kid. I read a lot of Friedrich Nietzsche's philosophy. I read a lot of Kierkegaard. I read a lot of theology. And to me, this is just a continuation of that. If you read all that and it doesn't influence you in some way, I can't imagine that. Well, first, why would you read that, right? So it's going to influence you. So I'm with Socrates, which he said that the unexamined life is, the examined life is worth living. I don't want to say it the way he said it, but the examined life is definitely worth living.
Well, what do you think would change in our society, or has changed in societies past, if the majority of people started living like this dimension isn't all
we'd
there
have
is?
a completely wonderful place to live. It would be just great. So listen, I was 18. I was in college. I was taking physics. It was hard. My physics professor was like a chain smoker, but he was a character, and I really liked him. And he would say things to me that I couldn't believe, but I then verified. He would say, we already have electric cars. Now, this is a long time ago, right? I was 18. And he'd say, you know, Diana, we have the technology to make this world a beautiful place. And I always was under the impression that the only reason we didn't make it a beautiful place was because there were things that were bad. But what I recognized was it was people that were bad. It wasn't just circumstances. There are hurricanes, you know, and there are things like that that are natural kind of disasters, right? But they're not evil. So once I started to realize that we're messing it up for ourselves, that's when I started to get interested in philosophy and religion. So I left physics. Physics was fun, you know, but it was a physics professor who told me this. So if we actually believed that there were consequences for our actions, like, you know, Socrates was trying to make people in his day believe that, you know, if we actually had that experience and we had an experience of an otherworldly intelligence that in a sense slapped us awake, you know, I think we'd have a wonderful place to live. And I do think we have a wonderful place to live. I think that, you know, it's an extraordinary thing to be alive.
I mean, your posture through all this, I think, is so incredible. Even the way that you came into this, not trying to prove or disprove. And so for the average listener who doesn't want to go like full conspiracy, and then you have full skeptic, closed down, like, how would you like encourage people to have like a mindset that might be open to possibilities, but still carry a level of like rigor and skepticism with the things that they encounter, especially because the media was such a big part of like distorting the narratives around like what's happening around this?
I know. I mean, honestly, it's so difficult for an ordinary or average person to come along and want to know about UFOs because it's, you know, there's so much disinformation. It's really hard to adjudicate, okay, who's going to give me a straight answer kind of thing, right? So, let me just acknowledge that it's really hard to do, to find that. But if someone were to ask me, I would tell them, because I've taught a bit about this in certain of my classes that focus on new religious movements. And so we'd read Leslie Kean's UFOs, Generals and Pilots Go on the Record, where she's basically just giving them the ability to talk about what they saw, okay? And then these are trained observers. So these are corroborated, you know, we don't know what they were, UFOs, you know, that people are coming out, risking their careers to talk about. So that's a good book. Okay. And then if they would like more than that, they should read, the works of Jacques Vallée, because then he gets into, you know, cause her book is basic nuts and bolts. You know, this is stuff we see on radar, craft, people observe it. Doesn't get into the subjective stuff. But Jacques Vallée starts with the subjective stuff. And he talks about that. And so, you know, each of those, that's going to be, those are two good entry points of getting into the topic.
That's great. Well, this was incredible. I think it just is so comprehensive in terms of how much you've laid out about what's happening. And I don't say this lightly. I really feel like you're like a national treasure in the sense of, you know, in a field that so often gets lost in like conspiracy or like woo. I feel like you've brought like an academic rigor to this subject that like I haven't seen before.
Oh, thank you.
And I think it's, from what I could see in online, helped a lot of people like work through this subject and become enlightened in some ways that they weren't before. So thank you for that.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
You wrote that people whose ideas and beliefs might appear to be on the fringe are on the fringe. They might be on the fringe of our future. And I couldn't think of a better line to open up a final question. So can you explain the context behind that comment? And also, when you look ahead, where do you see this like all going in like the next 10, 15 years in terms of like developments?
Sure. So yeah, a lot of people who progress culture are not understood, right, in their time. So they're literally on the fringe. And that's uncomfortable. That's an uncomfortable place to be. So, but it's an important place. And where do I see this? Honestly, when I published American Cosmic, I thought it would be maybe 10, maybe 15 years before the government did anything and said anything about any, program or anything like that. And it was literally like as it was being published that this happened. So things are happening a lot faster than I anticipate, obviously. So within the next 5 to 15 years, we're going to see a lot more sadly, we're going to see a lot more obfuscation by the government, about what they know and what they don't know. So I think the most interesting work that's going to be done is going to be done by people who are going into it. Kind of, I'm not going to say me, but, people who are doing what I do, speaking to people, getting observations, interviewing the people that are doing the science and so forth, and basically putting pieces of the puzzle together in this way. I think that that's the future. Field researchers, people like that, are going to be talking about what people are experiencing. And I think that's where we're going to see we're going to see a lot coming from the government, though, but it's going to be confusing. And I just don't see an end in sight for that.
Well, I'm excited to see what comes. So,
well, thanks for having me on.
Yeah, thank you for coming in. This was fascinating.